Thank you, Rachel, for that, as always, embarrassingly brilliant summary. It always leaves me feeling as if I'm now going to be forging my own signature, you know. Okay, well, here we are, and congratulations to all of you for staying the course. I mean, I think there ought to be prizes. Okay, well, it's kind of an exquisite torture being the last keynote at the Summer Institute. That's a slot that I've willingly occupied in every one of the 5 Summer Institutes that have been held since 2010. For a start, there's the heightened expectation that's built up all over the week from all those thoughtful, articulate, and downright brilliant keynote presentations that have gone before. These are hard acts to follow. But also there's the turbulence that these preceding presentations inevitably set in motion. By this point in the week, there are so many currents and intensities communicating and interfering with one another, and many of them are doing it right here in my own talk. If indeed it could ever be my own talk. I'm forcefully reminded of Jerry's comments earlier this week on writing agency, and how the most pleasurable and productive moments are those where mastery is absent and you feel yourself being written. And Iris mentioned that too, and amongst the many illuminations in her presentation, I'm grateful to her for helping me to think better about what kind of theory I might be putting to work in my own writing, and particularly from the point of view of my talk today in what would have been called data analysis. The kind of open-ended speculative citation work that Iris traced through the work of Maria Popova, Langer and Metzger has made me revisit the kind of associative thought that I seem to have preferred in my own work. So I've been thinking, for example, of an article on Baroque Method that I wrote a long time ago, or perhaps also wrote me, and belatedly I've decided to just summon it. You don't need to read this, by the way. It's more about an agencement, if you like, an arrangement. I'll talk about that later. Okay, so this is from an article that I wrote a long time ago now on what I was calling Baroque Method at the time. And that article ended with a 2-page example, as I called it, to try to give a sense of what a Baroque method might look like. And the example was called Don't Touch the Gothic Child. And it had its origins in an ESRC project that I was involved in at the time called Touchlines, about the problematics of touch between adults and children. And as you can see here, what the example does on a kind of surface level is it gathers together quotes and materials from a range of disparate domains. So for instance, it's got quotes from other authors, it's got field notes, it's got excerpts from analytic memos, it's got sort of editorial musings, and it's got images from artworks. So, it kind of ranges around Stephen Broom, Adam Phillips, Erica Berman, Joseph Cornell, Max Ernst with the Virgin spanking the Christ child in front of 3 witnesses, and Bart Simpson. There's a quote from The Simpsons in there somewhere. And although I didn't have the words for it at the time, I think I was kind of reaching towards something that is going to be not unrelated to what I want to talk about today. So that's really partly my excuse for being hopelessly solipsistic. I certainly don't, mention this to insinuate that I was there first or that there was any special merit in it. In fact, one problem is that you can see the hand of the postmodern puppeteer kind of operating rather too clearly, for one thing. But I think it does go to this issue of divination as a kind of what I've been calling speculative interpretation. In the past, I called this kind of method assemblage, not in a particularly Deleuzian way, because I wasn't in that particular archive at that time, but in the sense used by the art historian Ada Gizalugli of what she called a syntax of unanticipated associations. And I've often linked this, as in this example actually, with the little excerpt from Ole Worm's museum, to the Baroque Cabinet of Curiosities, another one of my favorite images. And the cabinets, or Wunderkammern, have been productive resources for thinking in my work. Although I have to acknowledge that they're problematic figures in many ways, because these cabinets were the product of colonial aggression and connoisseurship, mastery and accumulation. And they reflected the glory of very powerful human subjects, so in some ways they're not great for thinking about the more than human. Princes and merchants and alchemists. But for me, one of the attractions of the cabinets was that it's clear when you read the accounts of art historians and other historians who've looked at them, is that they were always unavoidably open-ended. They were ventilated by gaps and diverted by anomalies that escaped the classification systems that were themselves still in the process of forming. So they do have that kind of a combination of the urge for mastery and the almost kind of relish of uncertainty and unpredictability and oddness. So it seemed to me, as I said in another paper, that these cabinets were the results of experiments with order and disorder through material discursive practices of assemblage, and that's I'm quoting Barbara Maria Stafford there. And I found them good to think with as signs of a qualitative methodology to come. And as I've already insinuated, I actually prefer the word agencement these days. That's the original French word, for those of you who don't know it, that was rendered as assemblage for pretty good reasons by Brian Masumi in his translation of 1,000 Plateaus. But agencement keeps that sense of arrangement both as an ongoing process, the process of arranging, and as outcome. And in passing, I felt that agencement was beautifully evident in the keynote session on Wednesday by Emma and Gabriel and Jen. You could see that kind of creative bringing together of changing arrangements. So what was clear to me in my own work at the time, though I didn't have a materialist orientation or lexicon at the time, was the speculative nature of the logic that I kind of dimly was operating with. The fact that you didn't know what the agencement was going to look like or the connections that were going to unfold from any kind of outside. And similar to the experience of being written, the practice of, in this case, analysing data was changing for me, kind of before I realised it, I guess, from mastery through sorting and mining for meaning to a kind of what, with the benefit of hindsight, I would see as a kind of immersive, disciplined waiting for the chance event of what I later called the glow, the point at which the data becomes, in a sense, agentic. And I've thought of it since as that kind of thinking feeling that Masumi talks about, whose location and occurrence can't really be predicted and where agency is indeterminate. So now, in the turbulence of the week's events, I've started this presentation in a place that I hadn't anticipated. But it does feed into where I thought I was going to begin, which is firstly with the problem of interpretation in qualitative methodology after the ontological or speculative or post-human turn. I'm also somewhat exercised at the moment by the degraded status of ordinary language in some forms of new materialist and Deleuzian theorizing, and more generally by the absence of examples drawn from mundane everyday life in favor of invented philosophical examples or instances drawn from literature, film, or popular culture. It's not that there's anything wrong with such practices, and in fact, the examples that people use are marvelous for opening up and tapping into currents and getting a sense of the speculative and the virtual. And nor do I want to suggest that empirical data or materials have a special or prior claim in the new or transcendental empiricisms, but I am beginning to think about the implications, some implications of the increasing incursion of Deleuzian, materialist and speculative theories into the body of qualitative research, even though I've been, doing some serious injecting of it myself. So, I need to be clear that I do think this is a hugely productive contagion, even if, or especially if, it ultimately leads qualitative inquiry to the point that Deborah Britzman hoped for over 20 years ago, that point where it escapes the confines of its own congealed point of view and becomes, in Deborah's words, unintelligible to itself. And I think, in common with Des yesterday, I don't really have a dog in the fight about whether qualitative research has a future as a self-standing enterprise. It's more about what's been happening at the limits. And also, I think qualitative method, whatever it's come to be called, has always had a more hybrid history in a range of disciplinary traditions, even if a certain kind of congealing has happened. So, I think there's space for further thought about whether qualitative methods should merely receive the theoretical and conceptual infusions that it's been getting from process philosophy, new materialism, and so on, or whether a renewed qualitative method actually has something to contribute to the further development of these theories. As things stand, and particularly within some versions of Deleuzean philosophy, the social sciences in general have an abject status as the domain of common sense, communication, and craven capitulation to the order words of the state. Sorry, that was rather alliterative. As Stephen D. Brown points out, unlike philosophy, science, and art, social science never gets its own plane of immanence from Deleuze and Guattari, and in the absence of positive determination, it all too often is perceived and perceives itself as an epistemic practice caught uncomfortably between two better formalized practices, or as Brown more brutally puts it, as either manqué philosophy or faux science. Similarly, Mark Bonta has fairly recently welcomed the late arrival, as he sees it, of Deleuze into ethnography, providing the theoretical father that the social sciences have lacked. So he says, as you can see here, but the social sciences, dominated still by traditional, by which I mean pre- and anti-post-structuralist approaches, are orphan stepchildren in the process whereby theory moves from the continent to English translation into the humanities, and from there leaks and creeps into the social sciences, sometimes decades late. And I'm not really particularly bothered about, ressentiment or feeling that people from outside, whatever is our field, have misunderstood us. I mean, I'm not, that's neither here nor there. But it does kind of open up a large topic, which, I have actually not got much to say about because I'm still trying to find my way through it. So I can only sidle up to it today via an argument for divination as a viable speculative method that qualitative inquiry is actually well placed to perform, and in a way is already routinely performing, though we may not always notice ourselves caught up in it. So, within the field of qualitative inquiry, scholars such as Patty Lather and Betty St. Pierre have been arguing for some years now that we are or should be in an era of post-qualitative inquiry. And their argument would not diverge substantially from Bonta's in broad outline, namely that conventional qualitative methodology, as Betty calls it, and the methods that it generates are riddled with humanist assumptions that prevent it from making the move from knowing to being or becoming, and from engaging with more than human encounters and intensities. Betty St. Pierre and others would argue, and I have too, and still would in a sense, that conventional qualitative research is fatally undermined by its privileging of language practices. And one of the biggest problems with conventional method is that it wants to contain difference, excuse me, within what Deleuze called the iron fetters of representation. And that desire, I think, is evident in all those devices that you find and that we practice so often in qualitative method. Those devices for reducing uncertainty and extracting meaning from events, for instance, in the priority given to language, and in the deep methodic aversion to materiality in the body when it rises up into, for instance, interview texts or so on. Until very recently, we had very little sense of what to do with that, except to relegate them as mere kind of adjuncts or under-labourers to the business of language, or to try and pull them into a representational schema. So on this particular occasion, as I've said, I'm focusing in particular on the status of interpretation in post-qualitative inquiry. A post-human or post-representationalist orientation would undoubtedly confound interpretation to the extent that this implies a critical, intentional subject standing separately and outside of the data, dividing and distributing the general and the particular, concepts and their instances and causes and effects. In this kind of interpretation, something always stands for, resembles or opposes something else. And so what's needed, as many people have argued, including Hillevi and other people here today, are modes of research engagement that do not arrest process or bifurcate nature or assume the pre-existence and the preeminence of the interpreting human subject. So, finally, well into my slot, I'm getting into the neighbourhood of my topic. I want to think about exercises or techniques of divination, and I have to say that I'm not really sure that I'm going to find this ultimately a productive direction. I'm not sure whether I'm merely riding on the coattails of a few mentions of divination to re-describe what I'm already doing, but you have no choice but to bear with me for the next 20 minutes or so. There is some literature that has discussed the potential of divination in philosophy and the social sciences. So Marie-Louise France draws on Jung in her 1980 book on divination and synchronicity, and she calls divination the psychology of meaningful chance. Ina Semetsky has mobilized Jung, Deleuze, and Peirce and semiotics in her analysis, particularly of tarot as an a-signifying semiotics. And Terence Blake fairly recently, animated by Deleuze and Stiegler, calls divination the hermeneutics of contingency. And he's published a sort of 15-item divinationist manifesto on his blog, which is called Agent Swarm. My argument here, to the extent that it is an argument, is actually engaging mainly with Deleuze's discussion of divination in Series 20 of Logic of Sense. And other concepts get caught up in this argument, although I won't really have much space to develop them fully here today. And these include the concept of interest and what Deleuze calls the ethics of the mime. So Deleuzean philosophy gives priority, certainly in the Logic of Sense, to sense over signification and demands creative response to events rather than discovery of truth or meaning. In Logic of Sense, working from Stoic philosophy, Deleuze proposes divination as one mode of creative encounter with events, as a kind of future-oriented interpretation that works the chance and alterity that always attend events in order to extract signs for future action or thought. So he says the divinatory interpretation consists of the relation between the pure event, not yet actualized, and the depths of bodies, the corporeal actions and passions whence it results. So where conventional interpretation assumes a static or one-way relation between the general and the particular, divination moves between the virtual event in its multifarious connectedness with other ideal events and its expression in a singular present one. Divination must engage what Deleuze calls the problematic logic of events. He writes that the mode of the event is problematic, defining an event as singularities deployed in a problematic field, in the vicinity of which solutions are organized. Individuals, which could be rocks, microorganisms, persons, or opinions, etc., are the results of integrations or actualizations of problematic fields. And James Williams helpfully paraphrases this definition, minus the maths. Thus, events are necessarily ideal, that is virtual. As such, they occur as problems, themselves defined as a series of tense relations between ideas. And these tense relations that compose the problem are also described by Williams as a series of ideal pulls and turns born of an unstable series of infinitives and turning points. Now, it's kind of hard to grasp that language without going into lengthy exposition, which I won't attempt. But to give an example, well, not really an example actually, an allusion from my own field of research, which could be described as behaviour in early years education, as Rachel said. A particular problem conceived in this event structure might register changing relationships or relations between infinitives such as to teach, to learn, to listen, to pay attention, to provoke, and turning points such as to educate or to punish or to suffer. And then the task would be to counteractualize those infinitives in specific instances of classroom life. The task for divination, and for Deleuze it's always a moral task, is to discern changes then in these tense relationships amongst the infinitives of sense to divine turning points in the relation of significance among the differential pools of sense in a moral problem, and relate it to the depths of bodies and the states of affairs from which it paradoxically also originates. Willing the event is never a matter of the exercise of a free choice. As Williams observes, excuse me, I missed that one, there we go. Moral problems choose us as much as we must then select within them. Or as Deleuze puts it in one of my favourite quotes actually, to the extent that events are actualised in us, they wait for us and invite us in. This is because events on their purer virtual side pre- and post-date us in the presentless time of the ion, as Deleuze puts it. And yet paradoxically, events are actualised in the living present, in the infinitely divided time of Chronos. So one of the big challenges facing qualitative or any kind of researchers who are infected with the logic of sense is that of wrangling that reciprocal non-causal determination of two incompatible times. As Liz de Freitas has noted in her work, this takes us far from notions of time and space as mere containers for events. Anyway, towards the end of his discussion of divination and moral problems, Deleuze moves from the fortune teller to the actor and the mime as resources for thinking the capacity to represent the actualization of the virtual event in what he calls the pure instant. And talking of the actor, he talks of the two sides of the actor. So the character that the actor plays invokes the timeless quality of the virtual idea that can always be replayed differently. But in the in-the-moment performance, the actor simultaneously occupies the instant, capturing, as Williams puts it, the one-off quality of the passing present. The actor therefore selects and limits the actualization of the virtual event, distilling it into its purest and most concentrated instant. In that sense, the actor does represent the event, but he does it by dramatizing it in a way that envelops its sense or its vital significance. And the mime for Deleuze is actually the most exquisite adept of the sense event, instantaneously weighing and conducting the chaos of the forces and the pools of sense to express the unlimited future and past in the singularity of an instant. Beginning with a pure event, Deleuze writes, the mime directs and doubles the actualization, measures the mixtures with the aid of an instant without mixture, and prevents them from overflowing. The logic of sense is served and prolonged through what he calls an ethics of the mime. So what does all this have to do with qualitative inquiry, you are no doubt asking? So here's my pitch. I would suggest that something like divinatory interpretation could ethically be put to work in and as research. Indeed, qualitative researchers may be well placed to perform divinatory interpretation and an ethics of the mime, disposed as they already are to move back and forward between the virtual realm of ideas and their actualization in what might, under conditions of mutation or perversion, continue to call data. As I mentioned, this goes somewhat against the grain of the Deleuzian tendency to disparage social research with its investments in ordinary language practices. The ability to unmoor language from its lodging in propositional language and put its constants into variation to make language stutter and release its wild element as sense is generally reserved in Deleuze and Guattari for the child, the madman, and above all, the poet. But I would argue that something paradoxical and indefinable can and does emerge from the strange conjunctions of the singular and the connected in qualitative research under certain lights. From, on the one hand, the lengthy, careful and embodied immersion in the field, and on the other, from the chance coalescence of forces that issue in and as individual examples or data events, as David Roussel has been calling them. These examples lodge themselves in the mind, body and memory as enticing problems, precisely because they carry presentiments of their wider virtual connectability, coupled with the intimation of something occurring right here and now that is exceeding the ambit of method. So even that most disparaged of conventional methods, coding, I've argued elsewhere, can be seen in mutation as divinatory and eventful, as a kind of adventure in the cabinet of curiosities. I've previously described it like this. Here I am quoting myself again. The process of coding is both active and passive, a matter of actively making sense, yet also of accommodating to something ineffable that's already there. The researcher is at this point a live conduit between the materiality of things and the struggle for concepts, and one's shared entanglement with others, and with the uncut and unbounded totality of the data can be felt. Yes. In hindsight, that sounds like divination, I think, to me. One of the advantages of qualitative inquiry, in terms of its potential to be open to the event, is the opportunity, therefore, to work with what Masumi calls the terrible powers of the example. Masumi notes that it notes the event structure of the example as both singular and extensively connected, or connectable. So he writes, an example is neither general, as is a system of concepts, nor particular, as is the material to which a system is applied. It is singular. It is defined by a disjunctive self-inclusion, a belonging to itself that is simultaneously an extendability to everything else with which it might be connected. When it succeeds, the example transmits its power of deviation to concepts and changes their relations with one another and with other concepts. In other words, it taps into the virtual event. It would be a mistake to think that divinatory or exemplary techniques are easy or quick, or even that we can state definitively what they are, since they're likely to mutate in resonance with changes in the relations among the events that envelop them. They demand that we set up shop at the surface, as Deleuze puts it, and wait for the event. But this is not a passive waiting, and I think, again, Gabriel and Emma spoke of this and exemplified it very well on Wednesday. It requires care, attention to detail, and a certain willed loss of self-certainty in order to be ready to tap the pools, as Williams puts it, of sense in the event, or in order to be ready, in Deleuze's terminology, worthy of the event. We're not free to choose methods, techniques, or examples at will. It's not a matter of individual freedom or personal choice of concepts or focus, nor is it about free-floating immersion in the flux of events in order to discover what beach one will end up on. Since pure events pre-exist us before we are even us, demanding that we wait for their invitation, yet also requiring that we act, interpretation is always caught up in the logic of chance. And again, you could see that in Emma's and Gabriel's performance on Wednesday. There were complex durations, forces, and intensities, I think, in their performance involved in, for instance, the emergence of the chair as a powerful material, discursive, and highly memorable agent. It might be helpful to think of divinatory interpretation as fueled by interest. Isabel Stengers associates interest with what she calls the power of wonder, and she notes the aleatory logic that resides in the notion of being interested in something, that sense of choosing something that has also chosen me. She writes, to be interested by something has the character of an event, since it gives to something a power it does not generally possess, the power to cause us to think, feel, and wonder, the power to have us wondering how practically to relate to it, how to pose relevant questions about it. So agency is distributed amongst the relations and forces of interest. It's not clear where interest resides. And yet, if I am interested, my interest is also specifically mine. I'm turned to face in a particular direction in relation to events in the environment. And again, this kind of autopoetic interest need not be a particularly human capacity. So John Protevi, for instance, in Life, War, Earth, has identified a kind of sense-making that sounds very similar to interest at many different scales, including that of the single-cell organism. Jean-Jacques Le Cercle, discussing Deleuze's philosophy of language, also associates interest with force and novelty. And he wrote, what the exertion of a force in language does is to create interest, to provoke an event whose novelty is interesting. Expressing and capturing forces makes the proposition interesting and as such meaningful, provided, of course, that they are forces that are still alive and not frozen into ready-made meaning, prêt à penser. So, In conclusion, if we're to practice divinatory techniques, we need to find ways, if not methods, for encountering the field of research as a charged field, in Masumi's words, whose differences and pools are constantly shifting and in the process shifting us at the very moments that we are also acting. In common with other recent discussions of the status of method in post-qualitative research, I don't think this necessarily means an abandonment of method. For me, it might be about a perversion of method. And perhaps this demands a kind of renewed attention training, in Laura Cull's words, that would prepare us to unmoor or unhinge ourselves from representational logic in order to achieve a properly ontological participation, as Cull calls it, in events, and thereby engage the phenomena that we have become habituated by method to overlook or despise. Thank you.